On March 28, 1757, in the heart of Paris, a spectacle of unimaginable horror unfolded, etching itself into the collective memory of France. A crowd drawn by morbid fascination gathered to witness the execution of Robert-François Damiens, a man destined to become the last in French history to suffer the agonizing fate of being torn apart by horses. This barbaric ritual, a relic of a bygone era, was reserved not for a notorious criminal or traitor, but for a humble domestic servant whose audacity lay in striking at the sacrosanct figure of the absolute monarch. The story of Damiens' demise is more than a mere historical account of medieval brutality lingering in the age of Enlightenment. It symbolizes the collision of an antiquated world, desperately clinging to the notion of divine authority, with a nascent world beginning to dissect the very bedrock of power. The events of that fateful March day would reverberate through the gilded halls of Versailles, the intellectual salons of Paris, and ultimately contribute to the burgeoning revolutionary spirit that would engulf France decades later. To truly comprehend the gravity of what transpired, we must first understand the man at the epicenter of this tragedy. Robert-François Damiens was no revolutionary firebrand, no intellectual visionary, no political strategist. He was, in essence, an ordinary man driven to an act of extraordinary desperation, a fleeting moment of defiance that would irrevocably alter his destiny. His story illuminates the brutal response of absolute power when confronted, even by the most seemingly insignificant act of rebellion. The method of execution chosen for Damiens, dismemberment by horses, a practice known in French legal parlance as cartelement, had been historically reserved for the most egregious offenses against the crown. This punishment was designed not simply to end life, but to emphatically demonstrate the unyielding dominion of the monarchy over the physical bodies and spiritual souls of its subjects. It was a theatrical display of power as much as an act of justice, a public spectacle intended to instill terror in the hearts of potential dissenters, compelling them into submission. However, on that ill-fated March day in 1757, something went terribly amiss. The execution, meticulously planned to showcase royal power, instead exposed its inherent vulnerabilities. The horses, the executioners themselves, and even the assembled crowd seemed to recoil from the sheer brutality they were witnessing. What was intended as a swift and decisive display of justice transformed into a protracted ordeal of agony, with Damiens stubbornly refusing to succumb to death, even as his body was systematically ravaged. The detailed accounts of this execution, meticulously preserved by contemporary observers, read like passages from the darkest recesses of humanity's nightmares. Yet, they were undeniably real, witnessed by thousands and meticulously documented by officials who appeared both captivated and horrified by what they were recording. These records offer an unflinching glimpse into how a supposedly civilized society can regress into barbarity when its power structure feels threatened. This is the story of the last man torn apart by horses in France, a narrative that reveals not only the depths of human cruelty, but also the pivotal moment when that cruelty became too repugnant even for its perpetrators to bear. It is a story about power, resistance, and the horrifying price exacted for challenging authority in an era when kings brazenly claimed to rule by divine mandate. The France of 1757 stood at a precarious crossroads, teetering between two vastly different eras. On one side loomed the absolute monarchy of Louis XV, a system that had reached its apogee under his renowned predecessor, Louis XIV, the Sun King. This was a realm where the king's decree was law, where any challenge to royal authority was not only considered treason, but also sacrilege, an offense against God himself, who it was firmly believed had divinely ordained the Bourbon dynasty to rule over France. The concept of royal authority in 18th century France transcended mere political power. The king was revered as God's earthly representative, his person considered sacred and inviolable. To strike the king was not simply an act of violence, it was tantamount to deicide, an attempt to undermine the divine order itself. This entrenched belief system, known as the divine right of kings, had been meticulously cultivated over centuries to legitimize absolute rule and quell any potential questioning of the monarch's authority. However, beneath this carefully constructed facade of absolute power, France was experiencing profound social and intellectual ferment. The revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment were permeating the salons of Paris and the bustling coffee houses of provincial towns. Philosophers such as Voltaire and Diderot were fearlessly challenging traditional authorities, including the church and the monarchy. The very foundations of the old order were being scrutinized and found wanting by an increasingly educated and skeptical populace. This inherent tension between the old and the new created a volatile atmosphere at the court of Versailles. Louis XIV, unlike his celebrated predecessor, was perceived as a weak ruler. He was widely regarded as indecisive, easily swayed, and more preoccupied with his mistresses than with the affairs of state. The costly 7 Years' War was relentlessly draining the royal treasury, and France was suffering a string of military defeats that significantly tarnished the crown's prestige. Criticism of the monarchy, once unthinkable, was becoming increasingly commonplace and audaciously bold. Into this highly charged environment stepped Robert-François Damiens, a man whose very ordinariness made his act of defiance all the more shocking. Born in 1715 in the small village of La Tuileries near Arras, Damiens hailed from the lowest echelons of society. He was what the French termed a domestique, a domestic servant who moved from one household to another, never quite securing a permanent place within the rigid social hierarchy of the Ancien Regime. Damiens had worked in various capacities, including serving in the households of several members of the Parliament of Paris, the high court that frequently found itself at odds with royal authority. Through these positions, he would have been exposed to the prevailing political tensions of the day, overhearing conversations about the king's policies and the growing resistance to royal absolutism. Some historians posit that this exposure to anti-royal sentiment may have played a role in shaping his subsequent actions. The France that molded Damiens was a society of glaring contrasts and unyielding hierarchies. At the apex stood the king, surrounded by the opulent court of Versailles. Beneath him were the nobles, who enjoyed lives of privilege but were increasingly marginalized in terms of actual governance. The clergy formed another privileged class, exempt from taxation and wielding considerable influence over the lives of ordinary citizens. At the bottom were the common people, farmers, artisans, and servants like Damiens, who bore the brunt of taxation and had no voice in the decisions that governed their lives. On January 5, 1757, at approximately 6 in the evening, Robert-François Damiens committed an act that would irrevocably seal his fate and send shockwaves through the very foundations of French society. As King Louis XV was departing the Palace of Versailles, preparing to enter his carriage, Damiens emerged from the crowd of courtiers and struck the monarch with a small knife. The wound was superficial, barely piercing the king's heavy winter clothing, but the symbolic impact was immense. The attack transpired in the marble courtyard of Versailles, in full view of numerous witnesses. Damiens made no attempt to escape. In fact, he seemed almost taken aback by his own actions. Upon being apprehended by the royal guards, he reportedly stated, "I did not intend to kill the king, but to touch him, to make him think about the unhappiness of his people." This statement, if genuine, revealed a crucial aspect of Damiens' motivations. He was not attempting regicide, but rather making a desperate gesture of protest, a plea for the king to acknowledge the plight of his subjects. The immediate aftermath of the attack was utter chaos. The king, believing himself to be mortally wounded, began making his confession and preparing for the last rites. The court was thrown into a state of panic, with rumors circulating that this was part of a larger conspiracy against the monarchy. Security around the royal family was immediately heightened, and a comprehensive investigation was launched to uncover any potential accomplices. What rendered the attack even more perplexing was its apparent spontaneity. Unlike other assassination attempts in European history, there was no evidence of a broader plot or conspiracy. Damiens appeared to have acted entirely alone, driven by motivations that seemed to confound even himself. During interrogation, he offered conflicting and often incoherent explanations for his actions, sometimes claiming religious inspiration, other times citing political grievances. The weapon Damiens employed was a small penknife, hardly the instrument of a determined assassin. The superficial nature of the wound suggested either incompetence or, as Damiens himself claimed, an intention merely to touch rather than kill the king. Nevertheless, within the context of absolute monarchy, any physical contact with the sacred person of the king was considered an unforgivable act of sacrilege. The ensuing investigation laid bare the profound paranoia that permeated the French establishment. Damiens was subjected to repeated interrogations, frequently under torture, as officials desperately sought to uncover a conspiracy that may never have existed. His background was meticulously scrutinized, his associates questioned, and his movements in the days leading up to the attack traced in painstaking detail. The authorities' reaction to the attack revealed both the strength and the fragility of absolute monarchy. On one hand, the swift capture of Damiens and the immediate mobilization of the entire security apparatus demonstrated the immense power at the monarchy's disposal. On the other hand, the paranoid investigation and the ultimate decision to execute Damiens in the most brutal manner possible revealed a system deeply fearful of its own people and prepared to resort to extreme violence to maintain its authority. The legal proceedings against Robert-François Damiens commenced immediately following his arrest, but they were proceedings in name only. In a system where the king was both the source of law and the victim of the crime, there could be only one conceivable outcome. The trial was less about establishing guilt, which was self-evident, than about determining the appropriate punishment for such an unprecedented act of lèse-majesté. The court that presided over Damiens' trial was the Parliament of Paris, the very same high court where he had once worked as a servant. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that Damiens would be judged by the very institution where he had been exposed to criticism of royal authority. The judges, however, exhibited no leniency towards their former employee. They understood that the stability of the entire social order hinged on making an example of anyone who dared to lay hands on the sacred person of the king. The charges against Damiens were formally defined as parricide, not in the literal sense of killing a parent, but in the symbolic sense of attempting to kill the father of his people, as the king was ceremonially known. This charge carried with it not only the death penalty, but death in its most agonizing form. The law was unequivocal. Those who committed parricide were to be subjected to dismemberment by horses, a punishment that had been ingrained in French legal tradition for centuries, but was rarely enforced. The sentence pronounced against Damiens was solemnly read aloud in court with ceremonial gravitas. He was to be taken to the Place de Grève, the traditional site of royal executions in Paris. There, his flesh would be torn with red-hot pincers, molten lead would be poured into his wounds, and his right hand, the hand that had struck the king, would be burned with sulfur. Only then would he be tied to 4 horses and torn apart, his remains burned and scattered to the winds. This elaborate ritual of punishment was meticulously designed to mirror the crime in its symbolic significance. Just as Damiens had violated the sacred body of the king, so too would his own body be systematically violated and destroyed. The public nature of the execution was equally paramount. It was intended to serve as a powerful deterrent to others who might entertain similar thoughts of rebellion against royal authority. The preparations for the execution spanned months, during which Damiens remained confined within the Conciergerie, the infamous prison adjoining the Palais de Justice. During this period, he was repeatedly interrogated, tortured, and pressured to reveal accomplices who may have never existed. The authorities seemed incapable of accepting that such a momentous act could have been perpetrated by a single, unremarkable man acting alone. Contemporary accounts depict Damiens' behavior during his imprisonment as erratic and often contradictory. At times, he appeared resigned to his fate, at other times defiant. He occasionally claimed to have acted on divine inspiration, while at other times he asserted that he had been motivated by concern for the suffering of the French people. These contradictions only fueled speculation regarding his mental state and motivations, but they did nothing to alter the inevitable outcome of his trial. The morning of March 28, 1757, dawned gray and cold over Paris. By early morning, crowds had begun to converge on the Place de Grève, the ancient execution ground that had borne witness to countless deaths over the centuries. The square, situated near the Seine River and surrounded by medieval buildings, was transformed into a macabre amphitheater with wooden scaffolds erected to afford spectators a better vantage point of the proceedings. The execution was scheduled to commence at noon, and the preparations had been meticulous. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, hailed from a family that had served as royal executioners for generations. Even for someone accustomed to death, the task that lay ahead was daunting. The method of execution, dismemberment by horses, had not been performed in France for decades, and the practical details had to be painstakingly worked out through consultation with historical records and seasoned executioners who retained memories of similar cases. 4 horses had been carefully selected for their strength and rigorously trained for their gruesome task. The animals, according to contemporary accounts, seemed to sense the unnatural nature of what they were being compelled to do. They were restless and difficult to control, as if they too were reluctant participants in the day's events. The symbolism was not lost on observers. Even the beasts of burden seemed to resist the brutality they were being forced to commit. The scaffold was erected in the center of the square, with chains and ropes meticulously arranged to ensure that Damiens could be securely fastened. Red-hot pincers had been prepared, along with molten lead and sulfur, for the preliminary tortures that would precede the actual dismemberment. Every detail had been meticulously planned to maximize both the physical agony and the symbolic impact of the execution. As the crowd swelled throughout the morning, the atmosphere in the square became increasingly tense. This was not an ordinary execution. Everyone present understood that they were about to witness something extraordinary and profoundly disturbing. Many in the crowd had traveled from afar, drawn by a morbid curiosity about a punishment that seemed more befitting of the Middle Ages than the supposedly enlightened 18th century. The spectators represented all strata of French society. Nobles had secured prime viewing positions on balconies overlooking the square, while commoners packed the streets and alleyways. Vendors circulated through the throng, selling food and drink, treating the execution as a bizarre form of festival. The prevailing mood was a complex blend of anticipation, revulsion, and fascination, emotions that would soon give way to horror as the full reality of what they were witnessing became chillingly clear. When Damiens was finally led to the scaffold, he appeared calm but resigned. Dressed in a simple white shirt, he seemed smaller and more ordinary than the crowd had anticipated. Here was no obvious monster or fanatic, but rather a middle-aged man who seemed almost bewildered by the circumstances in which he found himself. His ordinariness rendered what was about to transpire all the more unsettling. At precisely noon, the execution commenced with the preliminary tortures specified in Damiens' sentence. His flesh was torn with red-hot pincers, eliciting agonizing cries of pain. Molten lead was then poured into the wounds, and his right hand was burned with sulfur until the flesh was charred and blackened. Throughout these initial torments, Damiens remained conscious and aware, his screams echoing across the silent square. These initial tortures, however horrific, were merely the prelude to the main event, the true punishment, the dismemberment that would secure this execution its place in history yet to come. As the executioners prepared to attach the ropes to Damiens' limbs, even they seemed hesitant about what they were about to do. The crowd, which had been boisterous and animated earlier, fell into an unnatural silence. The horses were brought forward, each one held by a separate handler. The animals seemed to sense the tension in the air and were difficult to control. Ropes were fastened to Damiens' arms and legs, connecting him to the 4 horses positioned at the corners of the scaffold. The executioners checked and rechecked their arrangements, knowing that what followed would test their skill and their resolve for the gruesome task they had undertaken. What happened next would be seared into the memories of everyone present and would ultimately contribute to the abolition of such barbaric punishments in France. The attempt to tear Damiens apart with horses, which should have been completed within minutes, dragged on for hours. The horses, despite being whipped and spurred, seemed reluctant to exert sufficient force to dismember a human body. The inability of the horses to complete their grisly task quickly became apparent to everyone in the square. The animals would strain against their ropes, causing Damiens excruciating pain as his joints were stretched to their breaking points, but his limbs stubbornly remained attached to his torso. The executioners, growing increasingly desperate, tried various strategies to encourage the horses to pull harder, but nothing seemed to work effectively. As the minutes bled into hours, the mood of the crowd began to undergo a dramatic transformation. What had begun as a morbid entertainment gradually morphed into something far more disturbing. Spectators who had come expecting to witness swift, albeit brutal justice, instead found themselves watching a prolonged torture that seemed to have no end. Some began to depart, unable to stomach what they were seeing, while others remained transfixed by the unfolding horror. The executioners, realizing that the horses alone would not be sufficient, began to make additional cuts in Damiens' joints with knives and saws. Even this brutal intervention did not immediately resolve the issue. His arms were eventually separated from his body, but his legs proved more resistant. Contemporary accounts detailed the sickening sound of breaking bones and tearing flesh, sounds that carried clearly across the now silent square. Throughout this protracted ordeal, Damiens remained conscious and aware. Witnesses reported that he continued to speak, sometimes crying out in agony, other times seeming to pray or utter statements that were difficult to decipher. His persistent clinging to life in the face of such systematic destruction of his body became an integral part of the day's horror. It was as if his very refusal to die was a final act of defiance against the system that was ruthlessly dismantling him. The crowd's reaction shifted from bloodthirsty anticipation to horrified fascination to outright revulsion. Many spectators later recounted feeling sick or faint as the execution stretched on far longer than anyone had anticipated. The theoretical justification for brutal punishment was one thing. Witnessing its stark reality was quite another. The chasm between abstract justice and concrete horror became painfully evident to everyone present. Finally, after what contemporary accounts describe as several hours of agonizing torment, Damiens finally succumbed to death. His body was then burned and his ashes scattered as stipulated in his sentence, but the damage had already been irrevocably done, not just to Damiens, but to the entire system of royal justice that had sanctioned such a spectacle. The execution, intended to demonstrate the power and majesty of absolute monarchy, had instead exposed its fundamental brutality and inhumanity. The immediate aftermath of Damiens' execution was characterized by a potent mix of shock, revulsion, and introspection that reverberated throughout French society at every level. The crowd that dispersed from the Place de Grève carried with them not only the vivid memory of what they had witnessed, but also a profound sense of unease regarding the system of justice that could authorize such brutality. Many who had arrived expecting to see swift, if harsh, punishment instead found themselves questioning the very foundations of royal authority. Contemporary accounts of the execution, penned by witnesses from diverse social backgrounds, revealed the significant impact the event had on those who observed it. Even hardened officials who had overseen numerous executions expressed profound shock at what they had witnessed. The Marquise de Pompadour, Louis XV's influential mistress, reportedly became physically ill upon hearing detailed accounts of the execution. The king himself, upon learning of the prolonged nature of Damiens' death, was said to have expressed regret over the severity of the sentence. The international reaction was equally noteworthy. Foreign ambassadors and visitors to Paris carried news of the execution back to their respective countries, where it was met with a mixture of fascination and horror. Enlightenment philosophers across Europe seized upon the event as glaring evidence of the barbarism that still lurked beneath the veneer of civilized society. Voltaire, already a vocal critic of judicial torture and cruel punishment, employed the Damiens case as potent ammunition in his ongoing campaign for legal reform. The execution also engendered unexpected consequences for the royal family itself. Louis XV, who had initially demanded the most severe punishment possible for his attacker, found himself haunted by the prolonged brutality of Damiens' death. Some historians suggest that the king's apparent loss of nerve in subsequent crises can be traced back to this pivotal moment, when the full implications of absolute power were laid bare in their most stark and disturbing form. The Catholic Church, which had initially supported the execution as just retribution for an attack on God's divinely appointed representative, also found itself in an uncomfortable position. The protracted nature of Damiens' suffering raised troubling theological questions about mercy and forgiveness that church officials struggled to address. Some clergy members began to question whether such extreme punishment was compatible with Christian teachings regarding redemption and human dignity. Perhaps most significantly, the Damiens execution became a powerful rallying point for opponents of judicial torture and cruel punishment. Legal reformers who had previously argued their case on abstract philosophical grounds now possessed a tangible and horrifying example of the atrocities that could result from the existing system. The execution provided compelling ammunition for those who argued that the law should prioritize deterrence and rehabilitation rather than vengeance and public spectacle. The practical impact on the legal system was both immediate and lasting. Although dismemberment by horses was not formally abolished until the Revolution, it was never again employed as a method of execution in France. The Damiens case effectively ended the use of this particular punishment, not through formal legal reform, but through the sheer horror it had engendered among those responsible for carrying it out. The long-term consequences of the Damiens execution extended far beyond matters of criminal justice. The event became an integral part of the broader critique of absolute monarchy that would ultimately contribute to the French Revolution. The image of royal power reduced to ordering the protracted torture of a single, pitiable individual became a potent symbol of the moral bankruptcy of the Ancien regime. Philosophers and writers of the Enlightenment incorporated the Damiens case into their broader arguments for political and social reform. They utilized it to illustrate the inherent dangers of unchecked power and the urgent need for legal systems based on reason and justice rather than on tradition and fear. The execution served as a cautionary tale about the perils of governance founded on fear rather than on consent. The case also played a role in shaping evolving attitudes toward mental illness and criminal responsibility. Damiens' erratic behavior and contradictory statements during his trial and imprisonment prompted some observers to question whether he had been of sound mind when he committed his crime. This raised uncomfortable questions about the justice of executing someone who might not have been fully accountable for his actions. The story of Robert-François Damiens and his horrific end serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and moral progress. The execution intended to showcase the absolute power of the monarchy instead revealed the fragility of systems built on fear and violence. The horror expressed by witnesses to Damiens' death marked a crucial turning point in European attitudes toward punishment and justice. The Damiens case underscores the profound disconnect that can exist between theoretical justice and its actual application. The legal system that condemned him to death by dismemberment was operating in accordance with centuries-old precedents and established procedures. Yet, when these abstract legal principles were translated into tangible action, the result was so appalling that it shocked even those who had ordered it. Perhaps most disturbing is the manner in which the Damiens execution reveals how swiftly a civilized society can descend into barbarism when its authority is threatened. The man who struck the king was not a dangerous revolutionary or a hardened criminal. He was a confused and potentially mentally unstable servant who posed no genuine threat to anyone. Yet, the response to his act of defiance was a level of brutality that seemed more befitting of humanity's darkest past than of the supposedly enlightened 18th century. The international attention focused on Damiens' execution also underscores the role that such spectacular punishments played in the political landscape of the era. Monarchies across Europe observed the French response to the regicide attempt with keen interest, recognizing that how such challenges to royal authority were managed could directly impact the stability of their own thrones. The excessive brutality of Damiens' execution may have been intended to send a chilling message to potential rebels elsewhere, but it ultimately conveyed a far different message about the fundamental inhumanity of absolute power. The gradual abandonment of such cruel punishments in the decades following Damiens' death represents one of the genuine achievements of Enlightenment thought. The philosophical arguments for more humane treatment of criminals, coupled with the visceral horror generated by cases such as that of Damiens, created overwhelming pressure for legal reform. The movement toward more rational and proportionate punishment was a key way in which European society began to live up to its self-proclaimed ideals of civilization and progress. However, the Damiens case also serves as a cautionary tale about how easily societies can regress to barbarism when they feel threatened. The same impulses that led 18th century French authorities to order the dismemberment of a bewildered servant have resurfaced throughout history whenever established power feels challenged by those it deems insignificant. The capacity for cruelty revealed in the Place de Grève on that fateful March day in 1757 remains an intrinsic part of human nature, restrained only by the moral and legal constraints that civilized societies impose upon themselves. The legacy of Robert-François Damiens extends far beyond the immediate horror of his execution. His story became an integral component of the intellectual foundation for the abolition of judicial torture and cruel punishment throughout Europe and eventually the world. The philosophical arguments advanced by Enlightenment thinkers such as Cesare Beccaria and Voltaire were infused with concrete urgency by the memory of what had transpired in Paris on that dreadful March day. The Damiens execution also contributed to the broader delegitimization of absolute monarchy that would culminate in the French Revolution just 3 decades later. The image of royal power reduced to orchestrating the prolonged torture of a single individual became a powerful symbol of the moral corruption that reformers argued was inherent in systems of absolute rule. When revolutionaries later challenged the monarchy, they could point to cases such as that of Damiens as irrefutable evidence of the system's fundamental inhumanity. The case had significant implications for the development of modern concepts of mental illness and criminal responsibility. Damiens's erratic behavior and seemingly irrational motivations raised profound questions about whether the legal system should differentiate between those who were fully accountable for their actions and those who might be suffering from mental illness. While these questions were not fully resolved until much later, the Damiens case was one of the early examples that compelled legal theorists to grapple with such complex issues. The execution also marked a turning point in public attitudes toward spectacular punishment. The crowd that assembled to witness Damiens' death expected to see swift, albeit brutal justice. Instead, they witnessed something that challenged the very notion of punishment as public spectacle. The horror and revulsion expressed by spectators contributed to a gradual shift away from public executions and toward more private, less sensational forms of punishment. The international reaction to the Damiens execution helped disseminate Enlightenment ideals regarding legal reform beyond the borders of France. Foreign observers who witnessed or heard about the execution carried their revulsion back to their home countries, where it contributed to growing pressure for similar reforms. The case became a part of the broader European discourse concerning the nature of justice and the appropriate limits of state power. Perhaps most importantly, the Damiens case demonstrates the power of individual conscience to challenge established authority, even when that challenge appears hopeless and the price seems unbearably high. Whatever his motivations or mental state, Damiens' act of defiance against royal authority represented an assertion of human dignity in the face of overwhelming power. His horrific death, rather than deterring future rebels, instead became a symbol of the courage required to resist tyranny. The story of Robert-François Damiens, the last man torn apart by horses in France, thus transcends its immediate historical context to become a meditation on power, resistance, and the human capacity for both cruelty and moral progress. His execution marked the end of an era in the history of punishment and the dawn of a new understanding of justice founded on humanity rather than terror. In his suffering and death, the servant who dared to strike a king achieved an immortality that no monarch could ever claim. The immortality of those who sacrifice everything in the name of human dignity and the possibility of a more just world. The echoes of that March day in 1757 continue to resonate today, reminding us that the struggle between arbitrary power and human dignity is never truly won, but must be fought anew by each successive generation. The memory of Robert-François Damiens serves as both a warning about the depths to which civilized society can sink and an inspiration for those who continue to resist injustice in all its insidious forms. So, as we've explored, the story of Robert-François Damiens isn't just a gruesome historical footnote. It's a powerful reminder of the fragility of justice, the ever-present potential for cruelty, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming power. It's a story about how one man's desperate act and the horrific response it provoked ultimately helped pave the way for a more humane and just world. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the societies we create, and inspires us to remain vigilant against the forces that would sacrifice human dignity in the name of order. What are your thoughts on Damiens' story? Were you surprised by the details of the execution? How do you think this event resonates with issues we face today? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective and continue the discussion. And if you found this exploration of history thought-provoking, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on future deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Thanks for watching.